Welcome to the Dark Night of the Soul Unwrapped.
Great title. Thank you, Fiona.
I'd like to begin at the beginning. What was happening in your life around the time your Dark Night of the Soul began?
I think I'd been fairly oblivious to my own suffering and not even recognizing when I was suffering. I think I avoided it in every way I could. I was busy, had lots of friends, had lots of social arrangements, had, plenty of work. And I sort of felt like I was a favoured son of God. That actually it was like, oh, well, I'm not having to suffer too much. I'm not having to go through too much. And then it all emerged around my daughter, Melissa. And she basically took her own life in 2014, having had a very serious mental breakdown 10 years earlier and seemingly recovered. And that completely sort of flipped my world. You can't just carry on as usual when something like that comes along. And I think I'd been very good at coming along, sort of going on as usual with all sorts of things and not recognizing them as really difficult happenings. But that was the one that really got to me. And it took so much processing. It took so much out of me and forced me into my feelings and forced me away from seeing life in the way that I had. And I knew I could never be the same again.
I just want to acknowledge what a huge life event that was for you. When you were flipped in that way, what then happened to everything you had been oblivious of before?
Well, I was forced to look at my other children and see that my fathering had been, I was never a bad father, but I was never actually a sort of really full-on, hands-on, making sure I was there from at all sorts of things. And it has actually sort of altered my relationship with my other kids. They were her half-brother and sister. Melissa was from an earlier relationship than my marriage. But I felt like I had to rethink all of the relationships in my life and to make sense of things again in a way that I hadn't. And to go through the pain. And that's the other thing, is that I actually had to sort of face my own pain. And I think with grief, it comes very, it's a funny process. For some people, they get completely smashed in the face and sort of laid low. I would sort of find myself shut down a lot of the time and think there was something wrong with me. But actually what I realized is that actually it was coming on slowly and allowing me to process it as it went along and forcing me to change. I think that's the thing, is it forced me to become a different person. Not completely different, but to deepen. I think that's what happened.
You mentioned a few moments ago that you'd taken yourself to be a favoured son of God. What happened to that relationship?
Well, that's a lot happens. That's a very good question, because a lot happens to that relationship. I actually thought, I'm doing good work on the earth, and actually I must have done something good in previous lives. I mean, it's so naive in some ways, that I actually thought, well, this is, I'm doing well. It's like I've been handed a nice chunk of life to work with, and that relationship, it sort of reminds me of the when God was put on trial in Auschwitz, where a rabbi and some of the inmates put God on trial. That how could there be a loving God when this could happen? And I think I had a very small version of that. That actually I was no longer a favoured son of God. I mean, that sounds so arrogant, and I don't mean it in an arrogant way. I mean it as sort of that I just thought, I'm a good person, and I'm being rewarded for being a good person. It doesn't work like that.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think that perception actually holds in probably quite large swathes of the spiritual community, in my experience, that somehow, and generally in life, that somehow things are going well because we're good in some way. We're healthy because we've done the right things, or we don't really suffer because we're doing all the right practices. And I think for me, one of the hallmarks of the dark night is that perception falling apart. As you started to feel the pain, how how was it then to have that equation flipped?
It was gradual, so it's like it didn't just go bang and it all sort of then tipped upside down, but gradually I had to rethink my whole philosophy on life. That actually the bottom line is it's not what happens to us, it's how we manage what happens to us. That I'm definitely learning. Um, and I think I had to recognize that there are no special ones. We get what we get in life, and we deal with what we deal with, and it will shape us and change us. And if I look at myself now from looking at myself through any other time in my life, and I'm in my mid-70s now, I like myself more than I ever have done before. There's that. I can feel the loneliness more. I live on my own, and I haven't got all the distractions I had of that. I think the pain of losing my child penetrated very, very deeply and in ways I hadn't expected. And I think I saw that actually this is an evolutionary journey that I'm on. I'm one of the billions who are on an evolutionary journey, struggling to become what I could possibly be, which is not about achievements. It's actually about growing into adulthood. And I think what you said before about spirituality was interesting because I have a real big thing about what is seen as spiritual bypassing. Because I used to run alternatives at St. James's Piccadilly. And in that series, we had all the great and the good speakers, Eckhart Tolle, Marianne Williamson, Ram Dass, Jack Cornfield, all of them came through. And I realized that many of them were actually spiritual bypassers. Many of them had created a very, very nice persona and a good song and dance act, but actually weren't really deeply in touch. I think I've always had that radar that's recognized when something's authentic and real. And for me, I was very lucky to have spent time with Ram Dass, who was most certainly that, and Thich Nhat Hanh, who also came to St. James's, and recognizing that actually there was something about the spiritual journey that is not a sort of a small thing. It's actually a gigantic step that actually we take through going through what we go through in life. And I still feel like I feel like a novice now rather than someone who's on the verge of enlightenment, which I used to, in my naivety, believe that I was very close to that place.
I love what you say about there being no special ones. And I think in my experience, I both perceived some others as special ones, but also before the dark night, there was an element of that for me too. Not that I felt I hadn't suffered, but that I understood, I'd done the work. And I sincerely believe that I felt more deeply than other people.
Well, I definitely understand that, and I'd start the same.
So I think there's something then in the unhooking of all of that, in a sense, seeing our own sort of narcissistic strands at play in this. And for me, seeing that also led me to see like, oh, nobody has this down. And as you say, some people have a good sort of song and dance routine. But for me now, that's actually a real indication of something that hasn't been seen or hasn't been gone through. And I wonder, often one of the hallmarks of the dark night seems to me that it's not chosen. And especially I think for you, when that happens through an external event that you had no control over, we're suddenly faced with our lack of control over life and taken into, I
Mm.
mean, nobody would willingly choose to go from being the favored son of God into the opposite of that. How was that for you?
Uncomfortable, unwanted, and also I had no choice. You know, I had to follow the trail that was there, and I do see that in some ways we are following the trail that's been set for us, even when we think we're guiding our own journey. I think I've always had my journey. Now I look back on it, my journey guided, not by some benign God who was seeing me as his favored son, but by the life that actually is forcing us to grow or is inviting us to grow. And I'm just thinking the biblical thing, many are called, but few are chosen. I think the call is there for many of us, and to choose to tread that quite difficult path and not to lose ourselves in distraction, addiction, and all of that is, it takes some doing.
Did you find there were moments where you could have lost yourself to some sort of distraction, or
Oh, yes.
what were the temptations, as it were?
I think I've always, like, I've loved distractions. I've loved sort of, beautiful women or sort of fascinating work or juicy friendships. So we chew into things. And I think a lot of it has been a way of avoiding my own journey.
So how have you come back to your journey?
Well, I had a part two of Dark Night of the Soul as well in 2021 when I had a heart attack, quite a serious heart attack, and I was rushed to hospital in an ambulance, and thinking that I was probably going to die. I was in a lot of pain and a lot of distress, and then suddenly in the ambulance, a moment came upon me where I was in bliss, and I actually saw that everything was perfect. I looked back at my life and I thought, well, I'm not pleased with how I was in my marriage. I think I could have done a lot better, but I was a naive and sort of quite foolish middle-aged man, not even young man. But all of that stuff. But apart from that, I just felt like I'm at peace, and I felt what it was like to feel that sublime peace, which didn't last, but didn't sort of like get snatched away from me. But it left a lasting impression. So I think that it's almost like, again, life dealt me. Who's going to choose to have a heart attack? But it dealt me a sort of like a pretty rough hand, and but it also there was gold hidden among the pain of it all.
You've mentioned being naive a couple of times, and I think there's really something in that there's something, some kind of threshold or maybe some kind of disillusionment that happens through these dark nights. What's your sense of your naivety looking back at it now?
I think I saw the world in quite simplistic terms, and I don't think I allowed myself to feel the suffering of the world or my own suffering. So I think the naivety was almost like sort of like magical thinking. And I've seen so much of this around the spiritual scene of magical thinking, that it will all happen. It's all perfect as it is. It will all happen exactly as it's meant to. The right thing will come upon us at the right time. And I always sort of trusted that I was going to be led on a sort of like a fluffy path that with Pachelbel's canon playing in the background. And of course, life isn't like that. It's going to, all of us will suffer. It's an inevitable part of being human. And will I let it mold me when it comes upon me? Will I let it mold me and shape me? Will I have the courage to stand in it and not run away from it or distract myself? And I see that as my journey in my latter years now, that of just following the trail and seeing what I'm being educated in, and starting to see that all my ambitions they were part of the sort of like, the sort of like the magical thinking. I was gonna I did a TV program for Channel 4 called Made for Each Other in 2003 and 2004, and I'd always wanted to be on television, so that was great, and they treated you brilliantly when you're sort of heading up the show and all this sort of stuff. But it's all empty. I think the truth is that all the real stuff is inside us, and can be catalyzed by what happens externally. But actually, the real place of learning is the internal journey, not the external one.
I think what you were just saying about magical thinking feels really important. And I think for those of us who haven't, the way that I see what you were just describing about being a TV presenter and so on, is like we can reach our ego ideals in that sense and then discover that they're empty. But I think the lure of that when you haven't reached them is actually really strong. I mean, you got to find out that there was an emptiness to that.
Yes.
But I think there's a strong, I mean, I get the word bewitched. I mean, it seems slightly off to tangent, but I think we can be easily bewitched by these things. And to step back from that, I think takes a lot, doesn't it? You know, when you build this very successful persona in the world, how was it to then, in a sense, step back and give that up?
Well, I'm just thinking now as you're talking about that, about, I was having, Darshan from Pir Vilayat Khan, who was the head of the Sufi order. I went on a Sufi meditation camp for 2 weeks, and he gave each person, he looked into their souls effectively, and he talked about his father, Hazrat Inayat Khan, who was the very famous Sufi, saying that there are 5 steps in the spiritual journey. I'm not sure I can remember all of them, but I can remember enough to make sense of what I'm about to say. And the first is that we're like a child playing with the things of the earth, and then we are challenged with something, and we're forced to go into something, and then we start to become disillusioned in life, and then we can learn to come back to life, recognizing the disillusionment and being like a child again, but in a very different way. And but the stage I missed was the stage of surrender. That actually there's a place where we have to surrender in the middle of this. So what Pivalayat said to me, which was very powerful, was that I'd surrendered, I'd given up, renounced life without having gone through it. So it was almost like I didn't want to have to sort of do all the sort of the hard work of being a human with all the pain that goes with that. I'd renounced it. And I think I was definitely in line to be a spiritual bypasser and a magical thinker. I was definitely on that path. And I'm no longer on that path. And I'm very happy that I'm no longer on that path. Although it's lonelier not on that path.
I want to come to loneliness in a bit because I think that's really important. I just love what you said about renouncing. I mean, I think there are so many ways in which certain kinds of spirituality can really match our inner state. So we can be drawn to something, some sort of renunciation, believing that we're doing this spiritual thing when actually what we're doing, as you say, is not going through it, is bypassing in some way. And I think that's something that's so easily missed, that actually the types of spiritual practice we might be drawn to neatly replay all of our inner defenses and neurotic structures. And to see that, to have that pointed out, how did you then begin to move actually into being here, into not renouncing or bypassing?
Well, I think I was very fortunate when I look at it now, and in running alternatives, having all these internationally famous speakers and brilliant speakers, and having my radar sufficiently tuned that I recognized when someone was really down, right down there in their essence, and transmitting, this is a word that Ramdas used to use, transmitting their words. So the words weren't sort of like cleverly strung together, sort of ideals and philosophies. It was a transmission of what was coming through in that moment. And most of those speakers did not need notes. They just spoke from their heart with the audience that was with them. And I think there was a fascination with that as well, that because I think true spirituality, if we to look at that word, and I think it's a very misaligned word. It's a bit like love. It's got so many permutations. But I think true spirituality, a true surrendering to the forces of consciousness that drive us is actually very rare. And I think it's hard won. That's why I love your title of The Dark Night of the Soul, because of course it has religious permutations and connotations. But actually there is something about the fact that we're on a journey, and that journey is not a gentle and easy one, but there are rewards. And I have seen, like that moment of bliss in the ambulance, I've had moments, and I think most of us have moments in our lives where we're at peace with who we are. We're at peace with the fact that we are incarnate. We are in a human body at this point.
I mean, it seems to me that that's part of the point of the Dark Night, isn't it? On some level, which I would struggle to articulate, there's a way in which we haven't fully incarnated when we're bypassing or we're renouncing or we're doing all of that stuff. There's a way in which we haven't fully stepped in, and it feels like that's part of the surrender, that the surrender can so easily be misunderstood as renunciation or some sort of giving up. But it feels like, to me, like it's sort of finer than that, that there's something about stepping into the flow, what's moving through in any given moment, which opens up a whole other realm in my experience. That all of this stuff, as you said, you'd been distracting from through work or relationships, or there's this groundswell of movement within us that often goes unnoticed. I think when we start to notice it, there's richness in that. I think coming into it, what's always difficult is that there are certain things I think we tend to imagine. One is that if we start, we'll never stop. That there will just be endless pain and suffering, and that somehow to step into that flow is hopeless in some way.
I've been educated in that way by the work that I do as a psychotherapist, mainly running psychotherapy groups, is that very often the fear when someone's about to dive down to the next level is, oh my God, if I dive into this, I'm never going to come out of it. I'm going to be absolutely drowned by my suffering. And because I'd witnessed that and facilitated that hundreds of times, I have to then turn it on its head and look at it for myself as well. And that actually, the truth is, I may not come out of it. I think Ramdas said something interesting once about madness. If we do go mad in this life, given that we are eternal beings, well, then that's one of the things we have to go through. I'm not suggesting that we actually allow ourselves to go nuts, but I think there is always a fear that actually, if we really let go, that we may not find enough control to live our lives again, and that can be very scary.
How fascinating that you'd facilitated other people in that so many times. I mean, how was it to be on the other side of that equation?
Well, there was something sort of comforting about it as well, that I knew that the reality was that actually it's almost like daring to sort of jump off the edge, knowing that actually there is something bigger than just random chance in life, that actually it's an invitation to go deeper. But it's like the early Christian martyrs used to beg for more suffering because they got so much spiritual growth from their suffering. I'm definitely not begging for more suffering. I hate the idea of suffering, but I think it's almost like if it leads us where it leads us, um, there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, but we can't do it for that reason. Oh, I'll do this because of that.
I think it's so difficult for us to be in, I use collectively, so difficult for us to be in that space without some kind of uh, gaming in that sense. And I think that's one of the things about the Dark Night, that it puts us in the place where we have no idea. We are in the dark. We don't know what's coming. And I think then there's a kind of a different sort of space that we move into because of not being able to know. And I think what you said about jumping off the edge is so common in the dark night, that there will be certainly for me, there was a literal sense of standing on the edge of a high cliff, or I would get an image sometimes of a gangplank, knowing that it was impossible to go back, just sort of teetering on the edge in absolute terror, feeling like I was sort of holding on with my fingertips. And yet the terror of going over the edge wasn't matched by the actual experience of stepping off the edge. And I don't think we're saying then that the fear is misplaced or wrong in any way. I mean, I think the fear is really natural, isn't it? Because we've never been at that edge before.
Well, the fear, I think the fear is absolutely right, and it's not even that there's anything wrong with it. And I'm just thinking we've got all sorts of tools at our disposal as well that we don't, that I mean, I know that I've been very affected by the teachings of the I Ching, which Jung brought to back from the East, and is a wonderful guidebook, is an oracle, and I know that that has given me sustenance and guidance in the past. We can also turn to wise beings. I think we have to recognize that we're not on our own, and that we can it's actually wise to seek support. It's wise to sort of like to be mentored in certain ways. I think again, part of the problem with this is that it's become an industry, so that you can go on fancy courses now, or you can see fancy teachers and spend thousands of pounds for another illusory show of fireworks. But what I'm talking about is something quite different, is of actually sort of like of recognizing that there is wisdom all around us and that we can drink from that. And then also we can have practices like gratitude, and which sounds really simple and sounds like it could belong to the child realms and the naive realms. But there is something about recognizing that actually we're in an extraordinary position, being in a human body, doing this life, learning what it has to teach us, knowing that it's temporary. We will actually move on, and I think actually the temporariness of it is a very important part of the journey as well. Because if we just were eternal, I think we are eternal beings. But I think if I, in this body we were eternal, I think it would be much harder for us to actually take on the curriculum that's being presented to us.
In my experience, that wisdom came in all sorts of unexpected ways. I can remember one time coming across the poetry of the Persian poet Hafiz, and drinking deeply from that well. Words from the Bible would spontaneously come to me, and I would sort of do a double take and think, "Oh, I wasn't expecting that." Or it might be a piece of music or a song. So I think I love what you say about, of course, there's a million things out there in the spiritual marketplace, but I think we're talking about something much less obvious than that.
I mean, for me, someone like Leonard Cohen, who's an absolute hero of mine, um, he was a sage in the guise of a minstrel. So his songs, and I listen to his words sometimes. It's like every heart to love shall come, but like a refugee. I mean, that's quite a powerful. That's from the song anthem. Or there is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Also from that same, which is actually taken from Rumi. Actually, that second quote. But I think there's something about, as you say, music, art, nature, we can be uplifted and educated by what's around us. But it's often much more subtle than the sort of like the brash, bold, I can transform your life in a weekend. Come and spend 5 grand and do a course with me.
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the things that happened for me, and that I see a lot when I'm talking with other people who are going through this, is a trying of those things, trying of the old practices or those kinds of offers, and then a sense of shame or failure because it doesn't quotes work. Because I think there's something deeply inherent in those kinds of practices or spiritualities that says how you are and what you're feeling right now is not okay, and so here's this way to change it. Whereas I think what we learn when we step off the edge is that, excruciatingly painful though it often is, it is okay that we're feeling what we're feeling. It isn't to say that it's that we feel okay in the feeling of it, but that there's something uh, inherently important and all right in the fact of us feeling what we're feeling.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, the thing is we're guided. We are guided. It's like, I call it in my book, that we've got a radar, which is also our instinct, but we are guided. And I think there is something about actually sort of recognizing that there's not some cruel God playing with us, that actually there is purpose. And I think that's the thing is I went through a period, I think this is probably also part of the dark night of thinking it's all meaningless. Um, Jimi Hendrix says there are many here among us who think that life is but a joke. I think that's actually a Bob Dylan song, but it's that sort of thing of it's like we're just here and it's meaningless. I think that there is meaning, but if we get too caught up in thinking we're an important part of that meaning, that's when we fall off the edge, not jump off the edge. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really important to acknowledge that layer, as it were, that strand in this experience, because I think we can't jump over that to see that nihilism, hopelessness, sense of futility is actually really important, and to acknowledge the part of us that finds it all completely incomprehensible. I mean, I think it's not unusual in these dark night experiences that they've begun with something awful happening, as it did with you. And I think it's really natural then that we are kind of on our knees just saying modern words to the effect of, why have you forsaken me? For me, that's often come in the form of, are you fucking kidding me?
Really, yes, yes.
And I think there's something really important in the expression of that touches deeply into something that, once seen, I think starts to, come back to what you were saying about the naivety and the magical thinking. I think there is something about the disillusioning of all of that that takes us into this place of futility.
Yeah, that's right. And as part of my magical thinking, I used to think that medicine was bad, that Western medicine was bad, and that actually, there were natural ways to deal with everything. And I remember quite a wise ex-girlfriend of mine saying, "Do you think God doesn't work through the doctors as well?" And I thought that was actually good. It was a very good statement. And I spent years with high blood pressure. I mean, 20 years with really, really high blood pressure, which damaged my heart and probably led to my heart attack. And refusing to, I tried every alternative, fasting, lymph drainage massage, infrared saunas, everything I could do to bring it down naturally. And eventually, I was doing a meditation with a friend of mine called Dina Glauberman, who started Skiros. And the meditation was in the meditation we were asked to look 5 years into the future, and I couldn't see 5 years into the future. And I remember saying to her, "I can't see." She said, "Take the medication," because I'd spoken to her about my blood pressure before. And actually, I did start taking blood pressure medication about sort of probably about 12, 15 years ago, and my blood pressure's now normal because I take the bloody medication.
I think there's something really interesting in this. So often, I think when we're drawn to that spiritual, magical thinking, that exactly as you just described, there's this very binary thinking, actually, isn't it? That, that side is good, that side is bad. And that completely fell apart for me. And actually, part of the beginning of my dark night was being diagnosed with a thyroid condition and starting to take the required hormones was liberating.
Mm.
And I think it's coming out of, again, that sense of being special. I think that somehow, if we're special, we do all this stuff, somehow we will rise above in some way. We won't need to take medication.
But I think also along with that, we also have to be discerning and to not just go along with after I had my heart attack, I was on statins for a year and I had horrible side effects. And I've had that all now I'm trying to find what the middle way looks like in that take what you can from the medical world, but also take what you can from sort of like the fact that there is wisdom that's not been used in this time. So I think we've got to navigate our own journeys and become our own healers as well.
I think there is something to say that comes back to your sense of the being guided and what it is exactly we're being guided by. I mean, my sense is that there's a deep intelligence to this whole unfolding. And it can be quite hard, I think, particularly at the beginning, to discern that. What is the movement of that and the promptings of that? And what is our other kinds of drives or pushes? Or so I think there's something to be teased out in the difference between those things. And for me, one of the senses of that is that the intelligence of this process tends to be inclusive of of everything, regardless of whether we've rejected things or not before. That it can move in all sorts of ways that we wouldn't necessarily expect. So it doesn't conform to our existing prejudices or belief systems.
Yes.
Is that your sense of it?
Yeah, I think that's probably is right for as far as I'm concerned. And I think that this intelligence, Jung said that everything is synchronicity. And since I read that sort of many years ago, I've sort of noticed things that happen that we often wouldn't notice. I think there is guidance, but I think there is also a danger of making that guidance into the specialness that I was talking about before. And actually just to recognize that actually we're not cast adrift in the universe, although it can certainly look like it. And when we look at the suffering around the world, it's pretty difficult to sort of like to encompass the idea of a benign and wise God. Um, it's a struggle. And, we don't live in a war zone, but it's like, what about the people in Gaza and in Israel who live in war zones or Ukraine and the various others? How can you relate to that in the midst of all of this?
I think that's a huge question. And I think there's something about, again, being in whatever we're feeling about that without ideas about how we should be in it. And I think these are such huge questions. But I think you said earlier on that you started to touch into not just your personal suffering, but the suffering of the world. And in my experience, as we continue to unfold or journey in this, we start to draw less and less distinction, in a sense, between the two. I mean, obviously, we're aware of what somebody else's suffering is and what ours is, but we're feeling it. We're feeling it all with less distinction.
Yes. Yeah, I think that, and sometimes and often probably suffering is the awakener in us and, for someone like Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, his suffering in the concentration camps, where he was awakened by his experiences and invented logotherapy as a result of that. I've watched some old YouTube clips of him, and you could see a man who was possessed by the spirit. I don't mean sort of like, the TV evangelists. I'm talking about someone who's actually come through something and nothing can shatter that anymore. But how rare that is to have trodden that path. And, his family were killed around him. He was tortured, suffering, and yet somehow his spirit became unbreakable.
And of course, I don't think we're saying that there's any, again, it's what you said about not specializing this, isn't it? I mean, it's a deep mystery, isn't it, as to who becomes a Viktor Frankl and the many millions of people who don't. And I think there's something that we can't possibly sort of know or understand
Yeah.
in that. There's a couple of things I wanted to come back to in this, one of which was God on trial. Where are you with God now, if at all?
If it, as I've often said this, if when I was young, I would have been asked, "Do you believe in God?" And I would have said yes because I was conditioned to have that. And then I reached a point of thinking for myself as I saw it in my 20s. And if I'd been asked the same question, I would have said no. And now I would say, define your terms. That actually, I think the idea of some sort of like, lunatic and sitting on a cloud and sort of dealing out loads of suffering to people is not my idea of a God. And I know that the Jewish tradition, the sort of there is that fear of God that is a part of how things are. But I think there is something about I think I believe in the evolution of being that we are in, that I am being shaped. If I look at my own life, I can see I've been shaped over my 75 years, and that some of the rough edges have been worn off, some of the arrogance has gone, some of the naivety is gone, and I don't kid myself that I'm, a million miles away from that either. But I think there is something about the recognition of, as you say, deep intelligence, and I wouldn't want to call it God, and I wouldn't want to sort of personalize it. I think there is something about we are in an intelligent, either we're in an intelligent universe or we're in a random lunatic asylum, and I'd like to think the first possibly true.
And it certainly sometimes feels like a random lunatic asylum, doesn't it? And I think there's something for me about having this space in which we can experience both or all, that we're not being asked in this process to land anywhere particular in any sort of consistent or firm way, and that there is yes, that this is constantly evolving. Just to come back to loneliness for a moment, that feels like a really big part of the Dark Knight journey and the subsequent journey. Is there anything else you'd say about loneliness?
I think I'm more in touch with it than I've ever been before. I was just before I came on this podcast with you this morning, I do an inquiry on a Monday morning with a friend of mine where we take 20 minutes each just to random thoughts, and the other person then reflects what they've seen and then switch it around. And I was looking at loneliness and feeling like all my life I've been able to distract myself through my work and through the sort of like, the sort of like the glittering goodies that are on, that are available out there that we can escape from loneliness in. And I think I'm more in touch with the fact that I can't really escape from it. At some level, there is a loneliness in the human condition that I feel like I've avoided all my life. And I don't particularly want to go there, but I don't think I have a lot of choice if I'm going to stay true to myself.
Thank you. Yes, that's my sense of it too, that there is a deep loneliness to be touched into. And I think particularly, I don't know if it's about the human condition as a whole, but certainly within the modern Western culture, that would seem to be the case. And I think in the Dark Knight, we're very much faced with that. I think once we've started to come into more contact with it, we're less um, frantic around it. I think for me, there was also, it gave rise to a certain sort of franticness that I wasn't aware of really until I became aware of the loneliness.
Well, I think what I unraveled this morning as I was doing this inquiry I was talking about was that I had always, even though I think I'm better than this, but I still think I've always looked for the external to fill up the holes in me. And loneliness is part of allowing the internal process to be what wakes me up to some degree. And as I get older, there's the fear, of course, of losing my faculties. In the last couple of months, I've bumped into a couple of very strong the men I've known as strong men who had a real sense of purpose in life, both of whom were now suffering from dementia, and seeing these powerful beings reduced to is also so like that's a lonely, there's that lonely state of what's going to happen to us. There's no, when you're in your 20s, you go into something and you come out of it and you're on to the next thing. When you're 70s and you go to your 80s and then your 90s, there is no coming out. And at some point, there is only death as an end. But I think that the loneliness is a challenge to find internal resources rather than external resources.
Malcolm, for anybody who's in it right now, who's really in the pits of it, is there anything you'd like to share?
Yes, there are tools that can help us with all of this. I know that when Melissa died, I knew I had to write. It took me quite a few years till I did write about it, but I then wrote my book "Slay Your Dragons with Compassion," which it wasn't a grief memoir. It was like what I'd learned along the way. And I think that we can actually so for me, journaling, writing, which eventually became a book, and a book I'm very proud of as well, was a very good way of dealing with the thick of it. I think there's also, I remember a few months ago, I was feeling really depressed. And normally I go for walks with friends if I can, but I went out into nature for 2 or 3 hours, and I realized halfway through this walk in the forests and by the lakes and streams and things that were there, that actually my depression had lifted because nature had actually embraced me. I think there's also sometimes listening to music that will sort of like lift our spirits, literature that will feed our souls. I think there's all these that we've got to find what fits us, and taking the risk of intimacy within friendships and relationships, of actually not keeping up the "How are you? I'm fine," which normally means fucked up, insecure, neurotic, and emotionally unstable. Um, but 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 actually daring to actually look at ourselves rather than wearing the right mask so that we can get through.
Beautifully put. I mean, I think for me, certainly the mask had completely fallen apart, so I had no possibility of putting that on. And yeah, I love what you say about writing and music and nature and taking the risk. Malcolm, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. I've enjoyed the dialogue. It's and it it forces me to examine parts of myself, which is great. And I think having these sort of dialogues is also really important, which is why I've got my podcast series. I'm having some lovely dialogues with people, and I've really enjoyed being in your platform as well. So thank you very much indeed, Fiona.
Thank you.